Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice, was likely involved in trying to overthrow democracy in the United States of America. Now, the way it reads, it seems as if this congressman actually has proof that Clarence Thomas was involved in trying to shred the US Constitution. Now, I said this on day one, that Clarence Thomas is compromised because of his own rulings that aligned with his wife, Ginni Thomas, but were contrary to everyone else on the Supreme Court, including every single conservative. I said that on day one. Now, this former congressman is saying the exact same thing. Now, according to him, he tried to blow the whistle, so to speak. I do not agree with his assertion. I will highlight this. Let's put up the picture of the happy couple. Yep. Clarence Damn Thomas and Ginni Damn Thomas. Question surfaced after Justice Clarence Thomas was the only member of the US Supreme Court to oppose the release of Mark Meadows' text messages. Who was Mark Meadows? Chief of Staff for Donald Trump. He opposed it. He said, no, this cannot be allowed, even though everybody else on the Supreme Court said, hey, Clarence, perfectly permissible here. There's no issue. It's an investigative body. They have the right to subpoena. He said they did not. There's more. He opposed the release of Mark Meadows' text messages in reference to January 6th. He said no. It turned out that those text messages that the justice did not want revealed had communications with his wife inside of those text messages. Former Representative Denver Riggleman, let's put up his picture. So Riggleman, Republican out of Virginia, wrote this in his new book that he thinks Justice Thomas is far more involved in his wife Ginni Thomas's 2020 election overthrow attempts. I have maintained, ladies and gentlemen, since the beginning of this entire saga, I have maintained that Ginni Thomas and Clarence Thomas were both co-conspirators in trying to overthrow democracy. As a matter of fact, that's precisely the reason why the January 6th committee did not want to involve Ginni Thomas, because they knew, the committee, that she would connect them directly to Clarence Thomas. There's more here. According to the Congressman, Riggleman, who left the committee in April, okay? He left the committee in April, follow the timeline, included many of the text messages that had previously been released from Ginni Thomas, along with the note that he had a difficult time trying to get the House Select Committee to sound the alarm on her actions. Now, according to his book, he went directly to Liz Cheney. And according to him, Liz Cheney is the one who provided pushback, and it developed into an argument, a bad argument, according to him. Now, I do question, why is it that a sitting congressman, because at that time he was in office, why would the congressman not go to the chairman of the actual investigative committee? Why did the sitting congressman not release a press release independently of this committee? If he found evidence of this magnitude, that is criminal activity to the highest level. Now, many people may be shocked to know the US Supreme Court is the only court in the United States of America that does not have an ethical guideline or rules of conduct. The only court in the country that does not have an affixed rule of conduct guideline. The only one. All right. Supreme Court spouses, according to the congressman, Supreme Court spouses, he says, are typically low profile. Ginni's involvement with political groups had already led to questions about whether Clarence would need to recuse himself in cases with a political component, wrote Riggleman. If Clarence had been in the logs, it would be a much bigger deal than all that. When I began to suspect Ginni and Clarence had texted the Meadows, I put together a technical brief outlining how we might be able to submit the identifications. Okay, Riggleman, who left the committee in April, said all of this. He said, not only did I have a suspicion, I developed a plan, an investigative plan that would have exposed the identities connected to individuals in this text message thread. There's more. Representative Liz Cheney, who was the effective co-chair, in effect, the co-chair was technically vice chair. Liz Cheney called him to express concern that telling Americans that such an influential figure had gone full Q would not reflect well on their investigation. Cheney was worried it would turn the whole committee into a political sideshow and overshadow all the other work the committee was doing. The release of Riggleman's book has left the committee members furious over possible leaks after spending a year with so few. Riggleman persisted in pressing Cheney to tell Americans about the Thomases. Did you hear that last sentence? I need you to read between the lines. The congressman said, I pressed the committee to tell Americans about the Thomases. Not just Ginni, not just Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas, but both of them. Congressman, what are you saying without saying it? There's more. Congressman Riggleman also said, some of the messages went beyond simply cheering Meadows on. It was legitimate for me to have concerns as to whether a Supreme Court justice had been involved in the legally questionable push to overturn the election. Was it possible that one of the country's 9 top judges was on board with an authoritarian interpretation of the US Constitution? The implications were overwhelming. Cheney found it all improbable. I think she still had more faith in the institutional GOP than I did at that point. Now, there are some people who are praising the actions of this congressman for coming forward. Let's be very clear. The congressman is trying to sell books. What he's saying is true, in my opinion, but he is trying to sell books. If he was a patriot of this country, so to speak, he would have sounded the alarm once he had the evidence to do so, but he did not. On Thursday, today, Politicos, Kyle Cheney reported that Ginni Thomas, the far-right activist and wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, will in fact testify virtually before the House Judiciary Committee today. This House January 6th committee today, excuse me. Thomas is known to have urged legislators in Arizona to block certification of Joe Biden's win in the state. Earlier this month, it was revealed she also did the same with lawmakers in Wisconsin. We already know what she did with members of Congress and Meadows, the chief of staff himself. I conclude that Clarence Thomas is involved directly, specifically, and intentionally. We will follow this story. Yasmin, thoughts here?
Yeah, well, this is the obvious concern that most of us had when we learned that his wife was so deeply involved in planning the insurrection on January 6th in the first place. I mean, as you mentioned, she was texting the White House chief of staff on the day. The problem with that was it was just a concern that we had, but we didn't really have a whole lot of proof that Clarence Thomas was directly involved, apart from the evidence that you mentioned regarding his track record on the Supreme Court. And to be fair, a woman is obviously a separate entity from her husband, so the marriage doesn't necessarily incriminate Clarence, but the assumptions that he was unaware and unsympathetic to his wife's operations were always very unlikely. It was only a matter of time before something like this came out that would more directly link Justice Thomas to the insurrection. And the bigger problem here is that despite this doubt being cast over the judge's partisanship, he's still sitting on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and he can only be removed by way of impeachment, and that's really it. And here's the other thing, the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming in this situation. 100% of the time, Clarence Thomas has ruled in a way that perfectly aligns with his wife's political and activist ideology, even when it's contrary to every single conservative on the US Supreme Court. There's some there. We'll continue to update.